Good morning, class. Welcome to today's Unit 4 introduction lesson. And the topic for Unit 4 today is exposures and risks due to poor environmental quality. So as we would usually do, we look briefly at the unit objectives. So upon completion of this unit, you all should be able to understand the human dimension with respect to environmental quality, discuss the health risks associated with or caused by air pollution, water pollution, inappropriate excreta disposal, and as well as we would look at solid waste management or problems with regards to that and human health. We will also briefly discuss the biological, chemical, and radioactive hazards in food. So, of course, bear in mind, as we usually do, the unit introduction really just summarizes the topic. So, what we look at in the unit introduction will be provided in further detail in your lesson notes, which should provide a guide for you to do additional research to facilitate the activities that would accompany these lessons. So what unit activities can we expect for this unit? We will be conducting a review quiz, and as promised before, the review quiz would actually be looking at both units 3 and 4. There will be no additional activities this week, so it would just be your review quiz. Okay, so let's continue by looking at an overview of the content of this unit. So we know that there's a growing concern about the links between the environment, our natural environment, and human health. For many years, even with increasing knowledge in environmental science, um, there there was not much of an understanding that there was a link, or that connection, that dynamic connection between the state of the environment and human health. It was often treated as separate units or separate components until recent years when as the state of the environment started to deteriorate, we also noticed that there was an increasing deterioration in human health, and there began our concerns that there might be this link between the two. So, worldwide, um, one quarter to one third of the burden of disease, so that term burden of disease, you all should know what that means now. One quarter to one third of the burden of disease appears to be attributable to environmental factors. Now that's pretty significant. Um, Next point, vulnerability and exposure. So vulnerability, you're looking at different factors that can lead or increase vulnerability. Children and the elderly, we know usually they would be vulnerable groups. Part of the reason for that is because typically these groups have weakened immune systems, so they are less able to fight off disease and sickness. Other vulnerable groups may be based on lifestyle, genetic weaknesses, all of these things. So if you have vulnerability for any one of those reasons and you add exposure to that, you have now created a very difficult situation in terms of increasing the risk of becoming sick from many of these environmental factors. So the health consequences of environmental factors and exposure are the result of very complex interactions which are not readily understood. So even though, as I mentioned, that we have an increasing reason to believe that there is that dynamic link between environmental health and human health, the complexity of that interaction between humans and our environment, there's still so much that we are learning about, so much about the environment and the various systems that exist, systems and functions, and all those overlapping dependencies and interactions we are still learning about. And even in terms of the human body, we are still learning every day. There's no full understanding of the complexity of the human body as well as our environment. So we continue. So areas of concern include respiratory health, such as um, a reaction such as allergies and asthma to the environment around us. Then we have the neurotoxic effects of environmental contaminants that can affect the nervous system, um, and other environmental factors that influence the onset of, usually premature onset of puberty. Um, Other concerns are food. How does food affect fertility and general well-being? So we have toxins that we are exposed to as human beings that can come from both the environment, both the air, from air pollution, from the unsafe food that we eat, that where we can have accumulation of these toxins in our food due to agricultural practices, from the water that we drink, and all of these things can have serious health effects on the human body. All right, so there we have some of the basic links and interaction between the environment and human beings. Resulting from all of this as well, we find we have increasing rates of cancer and heart disease, obesity. All of these have been associated with risk that they can correlate or link back to the environment. Additionally, um, diet and genetic factors. So when we talk about diet as well, diet would be associated with lifestyle. So and we will touch on that as we continue through the lesson. Okay, but I'm sure many of you, if you are aware of what is going on around you, you'll find that even now, like every year or every few years, we actually are finding that there are increasing rates of cancer and heart disease diagnoses, and even an increasing rate of obesity among different populations across the world. Then we have outdoor air pollution, which we know a big contributor to that is vehicle emissions. And this plays a role in the causation and aggravation of respiratory conditions such as asthma and allergies. Um, and it also contributes to accidents. When we have high levels of air pollution, we know we can have increasing incidence of smog and deteriorated visibility on the roads that can cause accidents. It Part of air pollution is also noise pollution, also from vehicles as well. And if you were to go to the EMA website and do some reading on the noise pollution rules and noise pollution information, you would find some of the effects there of noise pollution, some of the health effects of noise pollution. Then we also have pharmaceuticals and consumer care products like for example, your body lotions, your shower gels. All of these things can end up in our sewage water um, from domestic uses. Then we have water contamination there. Then we also have the increased use of electronic devices that can also produce um, a type of pollution um, by creating imbalances in electromagnetic fields that can affect the human body as well, because the human body also has bioelectric fields, and particularly a lot of that activity takes happens in your brain. So when you throw that off by exposing yourself for long periods to a lot of these electronic devices, it can throw off the electromagnetic balance of your body, leading to different types of disruptions in the human body. For example, I'm sure many of you would have often heard it said it's not good for you to be on your phone or computer beyond a certain number of hours, and particularly at night, because it affects your sleep. Um, we also have heard stories about, those persons who are engaged in computer gaming. Um, Many of them, they develop addictions. They go through the night, they don't sleep, and day after day after day, and part of that might be as a result of disruptions in the electromagnetic fields in their brain. So if that is something of interest to you, you can do some additional reading on that to learn more about it, right? So the chemicals, those chemical pollutants may act as endocrine disruptors. So your endocrine system would include things like for ladies, your ovaries, thyroids, adrenal glands. Did you even know that your pancreas, which when your pancreas is not functioning properly, often leads to diabetes? Your pancreas is part of your endocrine system. You also have glands in your head that are part of your endocrine system. So what we have is, if these chemicals disrupt the functioning of any of those glands, it throws off your entire function, endocrine function, and that can often lead to a multitude of sicknesses. Then some of these chemicals may be antimicrobials, antidepressants, um, from the pharmaceuticals. A lot of these, as we mentioned before, these things can end up in your sewage water. All right, and all of these things um, will enter your environment. So let's look a bit at vulnerability. Right, what determines vulnerability? Your genetic makeup. So each person will have a genetic makeup. That genetic makeup will be influenced by your ancestors as well. And many of us may have specific genetic weaknesses that may have passed down from our forefathers. Um, for example, you know that some people, you find families, you find maybe things like cancer and other types of diseases may pass down from one generation to the next. That would be a genetic weakness there. Then age, we know children and the elderly are vulnerable to sickness because their immune systems are weakened. Then you have your overall state of health and well-being. Diet as well can also, poor diet can also make you vulnerable to the effects of these environmental pollutants. Okay, so if your diet is one that does not contribute to building up your immune system and your general well-being, it will make you vulnerable. So what are some of the leading causes of the global burden of disease? We have childhood and maternal underweight. All right, so that would be a sign of vulnerability right there. um, Unsafe sex can make you vulnerable to certain types of SDZ, STDs as well, I beg your pardon. um, some lifestyle issues such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. A lot of these things are lifestyle diseases um, that result from, lack of exercise, poor diet, etc. Disease can also result from not having access to safe, clean water for sanitation and hygiene purposes. In some parts of the world, we know that poor countries and poor regions where they do not have proper sanitation systems in place, people take care of their business anywhere and waste. of all kinds can enter our water systems. Then in some many parts of the world, indoor smoke. This is characteristic in particular of poor countries. Indoor smoke, where women often use um, wood for fuel, and the types of cooking stoves that they have would produce a lot of smoke. So this is typical of poor countries. Additionally, if you are a smoker, tobacco, indulgence in too much alcohol, all of these things reduce your resistance to disease. All right. So variations can result from lifestyle factors, as I mentioned. So let's touch briefly on this lifestyle issue. For example, what you find, if we were to compare affluent nations to poorer nations in terms of the vulnerability to disease, what we find is that the poorer countries, they tend to be more vulnerable to the environmental factors, um, such as pollution, etc. Whereas if you look at the richer countries and more affluent countries, we find that many of the diseases that are dominant in those richer and more affluent countries tend to be lifestyle diseases, things like diabetes, um, depression, all of those things. A lot of them are tend to be lifestyle diseases that result in things like, as I said, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, um, reduced physical activities. In the richer countries, we tend to have more sedentary lifestyle. Um, we have eat diets. For example, the standard American diet, SAD, as they would say, or some other places you might see it referred to as MAD, Modern American Diet. Um, High in carbs and high in sugar. All of these things tend to cause your body to come into a place of insulin resistance that leads to diabetes. So that's lifestyle diseases and all the sicknesses that will come associated with diabetes, such as a high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and that is something that we in Trinidad as well need to be very concerned about, because the diabetes, it has been mentioned by our Ministry of Health many times in recent years that we have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world, and we have a small population. So this is not a good thing. This is something that we all need to be cognizant about, because some very, very horrible diseases or different organ failures, all these kinds of things can result from diabetes. So that's a lifestyle disease, and if it is a lifestyle disease, it means that you as an individual, you can change that, you can reverse that situation, if you are heading down that road. So that's just a little word of warning and a little word of wisdom for you guys today. So health effects of pollutants. So we're going to look at a few examples um, of the health effects of different categories of pollutants. Um, Information on these is provided in further details in your lesson notes. And again, you all are encouraged to read further on some of these issues. So your further reading should be reflected in your writing activities. Right, so health effects of particulate matter. We are aware that we have two categories of PM that we look at, PM 2.5 and PM 10. So, and we have some examples of particulate matter, black smoke, nitrogen oxides, and so on. So what are some of the health effects? Premature death in people with heart and lung disease. And it's interesting that very often you find those two associated with each other. Anytime you have respiratory and lung problems, it, it weakens your heart. Um, then we also have examples of other things happening, non-fatal heart attacks. We have an increasing incidence of heart disease in recent times as well. Irregular heartbeats, um, Although bear in mind, sometimes irregular heartbeats, certain symptoms may not necessarily be one particular cause. Sometimes your body may respond in similar ways to different things. Um, if you have asthma, your asthma will be aggravated, decreased lung function and lung capacity, and of course, as we were saying, increased respiratory problems, right? Then we have ground level ozone. So because we know that ozone is a gas that we're dealing with, right? It's usually not isolated to any one location. It can move over long distances by your various wind currents. So you can't even be um, feel that based on your location that you are safe from it. So what are some of the causes or effects, sorry, of ground level ozone? It can cause damage to crops by entering leaf openings and reducing plant survival. So of course you can imagine how that can affect your food security as well. Then we have respiratory problems that result, such as asthma, particularly in vulnerable populations, as we keep mentioning, children, elderly, and in this case as well, consider the vulnerability of outdoor workers, those involved in construction, in agriculture, those who, they have to be outdoors for long and extended periods. That increases their exposure to the elements and to those pollutants. It can cause damage to lungs, and it can also reduce your ability um, to absorb nutrients, especially if you have certain genetic characteristics. So you see, there are a lot of factors coming into play here. It's not only the pollutants, it's genetic, it's lifestyle, um, poverty, geographic location, because your geographic location can affect your exposure to certain types of things. Certain geographic locations may not be susceptible to, for example, we find tropical areas, we are susceptible to things like flooding and increased hurricanes and all of these things. We may even be able to link many of those incidents back to climate change. um, where we have incidents of flooding, we increase the risk of exposure to vector-borne diseases such as you know malaria, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, and all of these things. Also contamination of water and food and all of these things. Then on the flip side, if we look at the temperate region, look at what is happening now in 2020 with in the United States and many parts of the world that experience fall and winter. We find that this is a period that they have an increased risk of spreading the flu, and now even concerns about the coronavirus, COVID-19. All right, so you have to consider that even um, climate and geography plays a role in terms of vulnerability and health effects. And there's heavy metals. Um, so common air pollutants that are emitted predominantly into air as a result of various industrial activities, such as mining. So it can release heavy metals. Um, those heavy metals can affect brain function, cognitive function, as well as your central nervous system. And as we mentioned, children is a very vulnerable group. Remember, they are still developing, and the immune system again is weaker because they are still developing. All right, so they are very vulnerable to problems with their brain function and central nervous system. Then we have waterborne diseases. So we have, again, just examples here. You will get further details in the material on the e-classroom. Hepatitis A, cholera, typhoid fever, these are just a few. These can be spread by contaminated drinking water. Um, typically you find that many persons may get diarrhea as a result of these, and if they had get a severe case of it, it could become life-threatening. um, Organic chemicals can be found in household products, um, and they are also used widely in agriculture and industry. These chemicals can enter your groundwater and result in kidney damage, liver damage. It affects your circulatory system, nervous system, reproductive system. You see how many things, how many body systems it can affect. And then we also have radioactive elements that can be found from uranium mining and milling, coal mining, nuclear power production, and these can result in toxic kidney effects and also increases the risk of cancer. So I'm just going through these here quickly, because this is quite a bit of notes summarized here. And then we have sanitation. How does sanitation, or poor sanitation for that matter, affect human health? So poor sanitation, so remember that sanitation would involve examples, domestic household sewage systems, either the presence or absence of it, as well as the presence or absence of general solid waste management systems. So poor sanitation makes it difficult to keep personal hygiene the, and the cleanliness of your dwelling and clothes on a satisfactory level. So if we put this again in the context of what we are dealing with at present in 2020, which is COVID-19, just picture um, poor countries, or poor villages where they have not had a history of um, adequate sanitation, domestic sanitation in their homes. Um, Therefore, this affects their ability to keep up their standard of personal hygiene and cleanliness at home. It means now they are put at greater risk of infection for COVID-19. Okay, so sanitation is also linked to the transmission of disease, such as, and we have some examples here, um, cholera, diarrhea, dysentery, etc. And once you are affected by any of these types of diseases, please note it can also affect your ability to properly absorb nutrients from food, which would often lead to malnutrition. All right, so there's these contracting any of these diseases can weaken your immune system to that stage where you cannot properly absorb nutrients. Now we're looking at foodborne diseases. So the most common foodborne diseases take the form of gastrointestinal symptoms, excuse me. So those would be gut problems, right? Um, Unsafe food creates a vicious cycle of disease and malnutrition, particularly affecting infants, young children, elderly, and the sick. Again, all vulnerable because of, they don't have strong immune systems. So, foodborne diseases impede socioeconomic development by straining healthcare systems and also productivity, as you could imagine, because if you have a large portion of your population that are sick, they cannot work the way you would expect, and they cannot produce, so your economy would be affected. Um, Examples of foodborne diseases can come from many sources: bacteria, parasites, from chemicals. Again, this is just a brief list. There's a longer list in your lesson notes. Bacteria such as Salmonella, Listeria, you all should be by now familiar with some of these. Parasites such as tapeworms. This would be an intestinal um, problem, intestinal passage. Um, and then of course chemicals. So long-term exposure to naturally occurring as well as manufactured chemicals can affect your immune system, affect normal development, and can also lead to cancer. All right, so by now I'm sure you all should be getting the big picture picture that this link between the environment and the health effects, it is very, very complex. There are multitude of different issues and factors to look at, and sometimes it's very difficult to establish because, as I mentioned, sometimes one symptom that you might be getting may be characteristic of a multitude of different health problems. All right, so that's just one example of how it can lead to that confusion and make it difficult for you to actually identify and establish um, what the cause might be. Right, so what is our final word? What is should be the takeaway from this lesson? It is important for us to note that attributing environmental risk factors to the total disease and lack of well-being burden is extremely difficult because of scientific uncertainty and poor data. So I want to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. For please refer to eClassroom for today's activity. Thank you for joining me.